All right, good afternoon. Please take your seats. So the next talk will be introduced by Susan Gelman.
So good afternoon. It's my great honor and pleasure to introduce Marjorie Rhodes, who is an associate professor at New York University. So as you know, Gergo asked each of us older folks to nominate someone from the next generation who we think represents the best science of the field. And I'd like to tell you just a bit about why I think Marjorie represents the best science of the field. Her research is at the intersection of conceptual development and social reasoning. And as a field, we know that children construct rich conceptual systems starting in infancy. We heard some beautiful examples of that this morning. And that these include social categories or categories of types of people. And we also know that for adults, social categories can be a source of stereotyping, discrimination, and prejudice. But there's actually a huge gap between those two observations. How does the child go from concepts to stereotypes? How do categories of people become so morally loaded? Marjorie's research program tackles these important questions. Her experiments are utterly ingenious, and her work is overlooking long-held assumptions about children's minds. So as I think about it, Marjorie leans into the complexity of the problem. She works out in stunning detail how cognitive biases and cultural input jointly shape a knowledge system. And so in doing so, Marjorie is making serious progress on issues that are socially meaningful, I would say even urgent in the world today. But at the same time, her findings inform some of the most foundational theoretical questions of our field regarding how concepts are structured, how language affects thought. Now, not surprisingly, Marjorie has won a raft of awards, grants, recognition for her research. Just to give you one example, in 2017 alone, she won the James S. McDonnell Foundation Scholar Award, the Boyd McCandless Young Scientist Award of Division 7 of the American Psychological Association, and the Steve Resnick Early Career Award from the Cognitive Development Society. I think she may be the first person who got all three in 1 year. And I'd just like to end on a personal note. I think one of the most gratifying things about being a professor is getting to work with students. And I think out of that, the most gratifying thing is when we learn from our students. And I can't think of a student whom I've learned more from the first day she entered my office to today, years after she has earned her PhD, than Marjorie. And she will be talking to us today on how differences become different kinds.
Well, thank you, Susan, for that very generous introduction. Thank you to the organizers of the workshop for having me here today. I'm really delighted to be here, excited to share these findings with you and have some discussion about them. So I will jump right in. Social categorization is a fundamental means by which we simplify and navigate the complex social world in which we live. So to give you a simple everyday example, if you imagine yourself or someone passing this woman on the street, if you use an aspect of what she's wearing, if you use her hijab to classify her as a Muslim woman, simply making this classification can have a range of psychological, social, and behavioral consequences. So, for example, this can influence your perception of how dark or light you perceive her skin color to be, your memory, so you might remember that you saw a Muslim woman, but nothing about her as an individual, how warmly or coldly you feel towards her, your expectations of her likely beliefs, ideologies, behaviors, and so on, and perhaps even your own behavior, so how you might approach if she were to how you might respond if she were to approach and ask you for directions. So note all of these are a consequence of recognizing this thing that she's wearing as a marker of an important category identity. If you didn't, if you thought this was just a personal preference for a particular type of scarf, then you have had the same experience with her, but none of those psychological, social, and behavioral consequences. So one thing that we have to kind of think about with social categorization is that it can be very helpful because it allows us to simplify and navigate this complicated world of other people. But as Susan mentioned, it can also be problematic by contributing to stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. To begin to wrestle with the psychological mechanisms that underlie social categorization, one thing that makes social categorization somewhat unique from other domains of experience that we form categories in is that there's tremendous variability in how people can be categorized and how people are categorized. So this hand here is a word cloud. Some students and I just went online to an online research platform in the United States one day for fun and asked participants, just random adults, to list different ways that they could think of to informatively classify people. And so the font here is just proportional to the number of times a particular type of category came up in this little exercise. And as you can see, there's a lot of ways that people can be categorized. Some have to do with physical features like height and weight and skin color are there. Some have to do with psychological features, so smart and nice are in there. Some have to do with social roles. There's certain occupation categories, social relationships. There's lots of different ways that people can be categorized. So one basic question is, how much do we have to make sense of this variability from a psychological perspective? Do all of these categories basically work the same way psychologically, or is there important variability here that we have to understand? Now, you might think, and there is some way, in which fundamentally lots of social categories work in the same way. And we know this most strikingly from minimal group paradigms. So even among children as young as 3 and perhaps younger, if you create a novel, arbitrary, made-up social category right on the spot, you already see some of the consequences of social categorization. This is really nicely reviewed by this recent paper, in this recent paper by Yarrow Dunham, and one of the basic things that you find is that simply placing a child in a category, even if they don't know any of the category members and they have no knowledge or stereotypes about the group, that is sufficient to lead them to, for example, like members of their own group better than members of another group. While this minimal group work shows something really basic and profound about the role of group identification in human psychology and behavior, minimal groups on their own don't lead to all of this range of phenomena that I've listed here. So for example, as a simple example, children will often like their own group better than another group, but they won't actually dislike or have prejudice towards an outgroup based on just a minimal group experience. And often minimal group effects are sort of more limited and confined to how people feel about members of their own group, but don't necessarily affect their expectations or behavior of outgroup members. But some social differences, so some of those categories that were in the word cloud do take on this type of significance across childhood. So some social differences more than others start to take on more psychological weight to us. And so that's how that happens. How we take some initially arbitrary distinctions between people and start to think of them as marking these really fundamental social differences, these fundamentally different kinds of people, is a question that I and my lab have been really interested in the last few years, and this is the broad question that I'll be focusing on today. We can sort of move towards operationalizing this question of how some initially arbitrary differences between people come to be represented in the mind of a child as marking fundamentally distinct kinds by linking up with the broader literature on psychological essentialism. So let me tell you briefly what that is. Psychological essentialism is a set of intuitions that guides how we represent and think about some everyday categories. So for example, essentialism is what leads us to assume that this adorable baby tiger will inevitably grow up to be this ferocious tiger. We also assume he will grow up to be this ferocious tiger, not by learning to be ferocious from the tigers around him. So we expect it to still grow up to be ferocious, even if this particular tiger happens to grow up in a community of peaceful sheep. We expect tigers to have this property even if they don't look like typical tigers to us, so we still expect white tigers to be ferocious. And we don't necessarily expect other animals to be ferocious to the same degree, no matter how tiger-like they might appear on first glance. So we can understand all of these intuitions that we have about the meaning, about what it means to be a tiger, by suggesting that people view some category memberships as determined by a sort of internal, causally powerful essence that is obtained by natural processes, usually before the animal is born, is then stable across development, and causes them to have all those category-typical features. So essentialist beliefs have most often been studied in the case of animal categories like tigers, but people, and including young children, have been found to have essentialist beliefs, to think in an essentialist manner about some social divisions as well. So as illustrated here, gender essentialism, for example, is the idea that a baby who is born a girl will inevitably grow up to have this girl-typical property of liking pink frilly things, even though none of those tendencies are actually really present in a very young baby at birth. Now, one thing to mention is that it might seem, on first glance, that in some cases, essentialism is sort of a right way to understand the world. So, for example, this baby tiger will remain a tiger no matter what environment he grows up in and across his lifespan. But it's really important to keep in mind that generally essentialism is a set of conceptual biases, heuristics, shortcuts for understanding the world around us. It's not a direct reflection of the world. Essentialism can lead us to misunderstand a lot about the true variation that exists in the biological world. And in the social domain, not only is essentialism wrong, it has some really pernicious consequences. So essentialism, thinking of a particular category like gender or race or ethnicity or religion in essentialist terms, has been found to promote stereotyping about that group, to increase prejudice, especially towards lower status groups, and to inhibit positive intergroup relations. So I'm going to take this question of how do these initially arbitrary differences between people take on the psychological weight that they do and sort of operationalize it this way as how and why do children develop essentialist beliefs about some social differences more than others. Very broadly, there's sort of two possibilities by which you might think this might happen, really broadly, and I'm not going to spend too much time on these. One possibility is that which categories we tend to think of in essentialist terms is somehow constrained, either by some property of the mind or some objective feature of the category in the world. And then, of course, another possibility is that which category we think of in this essentialist manner is the product of some culturally embedded process of conceptual development. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but the data are pretty consistent with this second possibility. So here's one example of a study that Susan and I did together when I was a graduate student with her. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but these data are the extent to which children view race, so a skin color difference in the United States, in essentialist terms. And if they viewed race in a really essentialist terms, the bars would be up by 1. That's the proportion of questions about race in which they gave an essentialist response, as opposed to sort of treating race as a more flexible, less informative characteristic. And what you can see here is that the pattern varied. How much children had essentialist views of race varied by the community they were growing up in and across age. So essentialist views of race increased across age in what's marked there as a rural community in the United States, which was primarily white, not very much racial or ethnic diversity, and also socially and politically conservative. But the essentialist views of race did not increase across age in our comparison sample, which was from a mid-sized city that's relatively more diverse and socially and politically liberal. More recently, Tara Mandalawala and I looked at essentialist beliefs about race among children growing up in New York City. And we looked at these beliefs among children who themselves were black and children who were white. And these are 5-year-old children. And what we found here is that black children tended to have more essentialist beliefs about race than white children did at age 5 in New York, but that for all children, they had less essentialist views about race if they lived in a more diverse neighborhood of the city. So that's what's shown as an actual proportion of diversity in the city from census data is on the x-axis, and the kids' essentialist beliefs is on the y-axis. So you can see that for both black children and white children, if they interacted with people from racial outgroups in their neighborhood, the lower essentialist beliefs they had about race. So again, I'm not going into the details of those studies, but I just want to note here that if there was some constraint in the human mind that made it such that people sort of automatically view race, this is just one example, but in this case view race as an essentialist kind, we might expect the development of those representations of race to be relatively uniform across children and populations and so on. But instead, this development really depends on the diversity of children's neighborhoods, their own group memberships, and the social and political ideology of their parents, consistent more with a process of culturally embedded learning. And indeed, there's a great deal of variation across context, historical time, and individuals in whether, how, and when people develop essentialist beliefs about all of these different important social dimensions. So what the sort of general picture is from the cross-cultural work that exists to date is that it's very common for people to develop essentialist beliefs about some social division, but which social division really varies by context. So then we can start to ask, and this is what we're really specifically going to focus on, what does that process look like? What cultural cues do children pay attention to? How do those interact with their developing conceptual systems to give rise to some of the patterns that I showed you? This is a complicated problem. The part of it that I'm going to tell you about today focuses on subtle features of language. So we've been looking at how subtle linguistic cues, how people talk about categories, can spread essentialist beliefs about particular social divisions to children and then across communities. I'll show you some experimental studies that looks at one way in which language does this. And then I'll show you some evidence at the end that not only sort of can language shape children's beliefs about this aspect of society, but the effects of language are actually powerful enough to shape children's beliefs in their daily lives, in their daily experience. Okay, so we've been looking at generic language as a possible spreader of essentialist beliefs across communities. Generics are statements that refer to kinds instead of describing particular individuals. So examples include things like boys play baseball, a boy doesn't cry, Italians eat pasta. There's a lot that we can ask and study about these sentences. What's relevant about them here is that we were interested less in what they communicate about baseball, crying, and pasta, and more about what they might cue to a child about the status of the category that's referenced. In other words, that because they make these general claims about categories, from hearing them, children might assume that the categories they're referring to must be coherent and real enough for it to make sense for the categories to support these kinds of general descriptions. So if this is the case, then children will be more likely to develop essentialist beliefs about categories that they hear described with generic language. So to test this idea experimentally, we used a novel made-up category that children don't identify with and that they wouldn't have any essentialist beliefs about to start. So we made the group diverse with respect to race and age and gender. Each Zarpy is shown doing its own individual unique thing. So if you look at this group, there's nothing sort of that would explicitly cue that Zarpies have a lot of fundamental things in common with one another, that they're really different from other types of people, and so on. And then we're going to test if giving children a relatively small amount of generic language is sufficient to start to elicit those types of essentialist representations of the category. So we did a series of studies using this paradigm that was published in 2012, and you can happily read those. But we also did a more recent large-scale replication of this project, and I'm going to tell you about the more recent replication instead. What we wanted to do with the replication was to test a larger sample of children that had participated in our initial research, to try to get a more diverse sample of participants across different communities, not only from New York, where my lab is located, and also to move towards a more standardized procedure for this type of research for the field. So we used animated and narrated stimuli instead of individual interactions with researchers. And all of this was really designed to help us get a sense of the robustness and generalizability of the effects of language on children's beliefs. And this recent project has been led by my graduate student, Rachel Leshin. So to do this, we did it using this new virtual lab that my collaborator Sarah Jane Leslie and I have been working on developing, where families can participate online, and we record data of the children participating via their webcams on their computer, as well as by the software that presents the experiment. And then we record the video, we code all the videos for reliability and validity things, and in this way we can present experiments very similar to what we had done in the lab before, but online to a much broader sample of families. So the sample of families that participated in the project I'll tell you about now is about 200 families from across the United States and the United Kingdom who all participated online through this platform. The children ranged in age from 4.5 to 8. So much like in the original studies that we had done, children were introduced to Zarpies via a storybook. So they learned about Zarpies one at a time. And a simple thing would play on their computer, and we would record data via webcam, so you can see kind of what that looks like.
Zarpies. Look at this Zarpie. Zarpies love to eat flowers.
So we would just go through, the book would go through in a recording that played through 16 pages about Zarpies. Each one presented a new individual Zarpie doing a new property, and half the children heard the property always described generically, as in Zarpies love to sing, and the other half heard it described with specific language, as in this Zarpie loves to sing. So here's another example from the book and another example. After they went through the book, they then completed a series of questions to assess the extent to which they were now thinking about the category of Zarpies in an essentialist manner. So one of these asked them to guess or to say whether they thought a Zarpie was doing a category-related behavior, in this case chasing a shadow, because of some intrinsic causal mechanism that's shared across members of the category Zarpies, which would be consistent with an essentialist representation of the category, or a more idiosyncratic extrinsic reason. And so here's what that looks like.
Look at this Zarpie. He's chasing a shadow. Let's think about why this Zarpie may be chasing a shadow. Do you think it's because a lot of Zarpies love to chase shadows? Or because he is running a race?
A lot of Zarpies love to chase shadows.
So they did a few items like that. Then we assessed whether they're thinking that the boundary between Zarpies and other types of people is discrete, which would be consistent with an essentialist intuition, or more fuzzy. And we did this by asking them if they thought Zarpies could only ever do Zarpie behaviors, which were kind of weird, or whether the people who were Zarpies might also do other things. So that looked like this. Whoops.
Now for a different type of question. Look at this Zarpie. This Zarpie flaps her arms when she's happy. Do you think the Zarpie might sometimes say hooray when she's happy too? Or only flap her arms?
We also asked them whether they thought Zarpie properties were innate by telling them about a baby who was born to a Zarpie mom but grew up with a non-Zarpie mom, and asking them to guess whether the grown-up baby would hate ice cream like the very odd Zarpie mom or love ice cream like the other mom. And then to begin to assess some of the negative consequences of essentialism, we also included a resource allocation task that very quickly looked like this.
She draws stars on her knees. This is not a Zarpie. She doesn't draw stars on her knees. Imagine that you had an extra cookie that you wanted to share. Who are you going to share your cookie with? The one who is a Zarpie or the one who is not a Zarpie?
Okay.
This is
Again. Okay, so we found in this project, very similar to the lab-based studies that we had done before, that children who heard the generic descriptions of Zarpies initially had more essentialist beliefs about the category. And we found that when we collapsed across all the different measures of essentialism, and we found them for most of the measures of essentialism when we examined them separately. So this is children's responses about the intrinsic causal mechanism. So is a Zarpie chasing a shadow? Because of a lot of Zarpies love to do that, so something intrinsic that's shared across Zarpies, more of an essentialist response, or just because of something idiosyncratic that that particular child is doing. And children were more likely to endorse the intrinsic causal mechanisms if they had first heard generics about the category. This is their belief about the discreteness of category boundaries. So do you think the Zarpie could sometimes say hooray when she's happy, which would suggest the boundary between Zarpies isn't that strict? Sometimes Zarpies do Zarpie things, sometimes they do not Zarpie things. Or do you think she only flaps her arms, so Zarpies only ever do Zarpie things? And children were more likely to endorse the essentialist response for that as well, if they'd heard generic language than specific language. The findings on the innateness measure, where children were told a baby is born to one parent but grows up, one parent who's a Zarpie but grows up with a parent who's not a Zarpie, were a little bit unexpected and interacted with age. So we found that children in the generic condition, they endorsed the innate response, the essentialist more with age in the generic condition, but their responses did not increase towards the innateness as much with age in the specific condition. So it's possible that this component of essentialism is not influenced by generics as much as those other two. However, I'll also just note that when we set up this kind of weird adoption story online, we didn't include as many attention and comprehension checks with the story as we typically would have done if we were interacting on a personal level with the child. So it's also possible the younger children didn't fully understand this very odd story, so that's something that we'll continue to work on. Consistent with some of the negative consequences of essentialism, we also found that children were less likely to share the cookie and other resources with the Zarpie after they heard generic language about them, meaning they were more likely to give those resources to somebody else. Okay. So what I've shown you so far is that hearing generic language about this social division that started off as arbitrary began to elicit essentialist representations of that social category in young children. So we suggest that generics might do this by serving as sort of a cultural signal to social kinds. So when children hear a category talked about with generics, they assume it must represent a real and meaningful division in their environment, and they develop essentialist beliefs about that division. For this to be the case, though, we also have to think about where generic input comes from. So for that sort of model of transmission to work, then generics not only have to elicit essentialism from children, they also have to reflect speakers' beliefs. So speakers have to be more likely to generate generics for categories that they themselves have those essentialist beliefs about, and only if so could generics sort of serve as a plausible mechanism by which those beliefs are communicated to children across generations. So we tested to see if that was the case in the original set of studies that we did about Zarpies, but in this case we introduced parents to Zarpies first, and we did not do that with generic language. We manipulated parents' beliefs about this made-up category of people by either prompting parents to develop essentialist representations of Zarpies. We gave them a paragraph, and it basically communicated the idea that scientists had discovered some people, and they studied them in detail, and they discovered they're very different from anyone else they've ever thought about before. They had discovered this new population, and they called them Zarpies. So it kind of communicates explicitly to parents this idea that Zarpies is an essentialized kind. And then other parents instead were led to think of this Zarpie thing as more arbitrary. So scientists discovered some people, but they studied them, and they were just like everybody else. They decided to call them Zarpies, but it didn't really mean very much. Okay, so we manipulated parents' beliefs about Zarpies. Then we brought parents and children together and gave them a picture book of Zarpies, but this time it didn't have any language with the pictures. We just asked parents to describe the pictures however they wanted to. So we were thinking that if parents who are now thinking of Zarpies in more essentialist terms, they might treat an individual Zarpie as standing in for the category as a whole and say things like, oh look, Zarpies are afraid of ladybugs. But if they're just thinking about Zarpies as sort of an ad hoc collection of individuals, they might look at this picture and just say something like, oh, look, she is afraid of the ladybug. So we had the parents and children go through the pictures, and we recorded them, and we transcribed and coded their speech. So here's a clip that shows a parent and a child talking about that picture. This is a parent who had been induced to have an essentialist representation of Zarpies. Okay, so as you can see, she was always looking at pictures of individuals, but she had a pretty strong tendency to make claims about the group as a whole, saying Zarpi people do this, or when they get scared, they do this. And what we found in the population of families who participated in the project was that parents who were induced to have essentialist beliefs were about 2.5 times more likely to generate generics in their subsequent conversation with their children. So we think this is consistent with the possibility that generics both reflect and shape essentialist beliefs about social kinds, and therefore could serve as a plausible mechanism by which essentialist beliefs about particular social divisions are spread across communities. So I'd now like to turn to talk a little bit in more detail about how generics are doing this. And the first thing to note is that generics on their own do not create or directly communicate essentialist thought. So if you consider statements like, girls like pink, girls play house, girls have long hair, those are all generics about gender, very similar in structure to the sentences that I showed you. And they are consistent with many interpretations that have nothing to do with essentialism. So you might think as an adult that girls like pink because people only buy pink things for them because that's all they have labeled for girls at the store. There's nothing in that interpretation, and there's nothing directly in the sentence that says the reason girls do this is because it's intrinsic. Girls just intrinsically love pink. There's nothing in these sentences that suggests girls only like pink and not other types of colors. There's nothing in these sentences that says girls would like pink no matter what their context. But the studies that I showed you in the first part suggested that children sometimes draw all of those types of inferences from generic descriptions of categories. So it's kind of puzzling. Why are they doing that? Their inferences are going way beyond the content. So in the framework that we have been working on in the lab, it's the case that generics do not directly communicate or create essentialist thoughts. They do so, they can sort of elicit these essentialist intuitions because of how they interact with other aspects of children's developing minds. So we suggest that generics have the consequences they do because of the role they play in communicative exchanges. So one of the basic processes that underlies language acquisition is a tendency to assume that speakers know the right way to categorize and name things. We also know that by age 2, children recognize the linguistic form of a generic as referring to an abstract category, not to a specific individual or a subset. So if you sort of combine these things, it suggests that when children hear a generic about gender, for example, they hear girls like pink, they recognize that that's a general claim, that the speaker has used the label to make a general claim about the group, and they assume that the speaker, not always, but maybe at baseline, they assume the speaker knows the right way to talk about things, the right way to use labels and talk about categories, so that this sort of serves as a signal of the speaker's beliefs that it's a meaningful kind. So it's not directly communicating all of that information, but it's sending a signal that the speaker views the category as having that status. Okay, one unique prediction of that perspective on what generics are doing is that it's kind of independent of the content they communicate. In this case, generics influence children's beliefs even if they don't communicate any useful content about the category. And we can test that, and we have tested that, by seeing what happens, what children learn from generics that they later find out are wrong or that are later negated. So take this simple example. If a child hears girls like pink, and then another speaker comes in and says, oh no, they don't. At the end of this, the child might be confused as to whether girls like pink or not. But they still heard 2 speakers use generics to talk about the category of girls. So if what the generic is doing is serving as a signal of the speaker's representations, they've still gotten the content that the speakers view gender as sort of a meaningful way to divide up people and talk about them, even if they haven't actually learned anything new about what girls have in common with one another or what makes them different from boys. So to test what children infer in these kinds of contexts, we again started with a novel category where children heard a series of generics, again about Zarpies, which were responded to in one of 2 ways. So in what we're calling the generic rejection condition, they heard someone say something like, Zarpies have striped hair, And the person responded, no, that's not right about Zarpies. So in this case, they're undermining, they're contradicting the property about the hair, but they're maintaining the generic scope of the sentence. So it looked like this.
Zarpies love to eat pickles. No, that's not right about Zarpies. Zarpies have striped hair. No, that's not right about Zarpies.
Okay, and this is a project that's being led by Emily Foster Hansen, who is also the puppeteer there. So in the comparison condition, the speaker agreed with the property, but this time contradicted the generic scope instead. So that looked like this. Whoops. That looked like this.
Zarpies have striped hair. No. This Zarpie has striped hair.
Okay. So if generics elicit essentialist beliefs by signaling that the speakers think of the categories a meaningful kind, then children should have more essentialist responses after they see a series of generics that are corrected in the first way, in the way that questions the property but maintains the generic scope of how the category is being talked about in the sentence. They should have more essentialist beliefs after they've heard those kinds of corrections than after they've heard the second type, where they hear the property agreed with, but the generic scope questioned by the second speaker. So in our study, children saw 8 instances of a speaker making a generic claim about the novel group that was then contradicted in one of the 2 ways, and then they completed similar assessments of essentialist beliefs as in the previous study. So for example, they were asked to endorse either an intrinsic shared mechanism for a category-related feature or a more external one. And what we found is that children in our generics condition, so the condition where they didn't actually learn any properties of Zarpies but heard a lot of generics about them, they were more likely to subsequently endorse intrinsic causal mechanisms for the behavior of individual Zarpies, consistent with an essentialist belief, compared to children who heard the same information but that heard corrections that maintained the property and instead contradicted the scope. Okay. So these findings suggest that generics influence children's beliefs even when they don't communicate useful information, consistent with the idea that what they're doing in part is serving as a signal to speakers' representations of the category, not the speaker's beliefs about particular properties necessarily. Also consistent with this general idea and part of this general framework that we're working on, in a separate project led by my graduate student Kelsey Modi, we have found that the inferences that children draw from generics depend on the epistemic state of the speaker. So children draw stronger inferences from generics if they trust that the speaker knows a lot about the category that they're talking about than when they're given the same information but from a speaker who's less knowledgeable about the meaning of the category. So in the studies that I've shown you so far today, the one was webcam based, but even so, they were all basically controlled lab experiments where we controlled exactly what the children were hearing all the time. They were designed in a way to maximize children's attention to the linguistic features that we wanted them to pay attention to, and then we immediately tested their behavior. This is, of course, how we set up a lot of experiments, probably how lots of us set up lots of experiments, and those are all the things that are really important to do to draw valid conclusions about whether subtle features of language can cause change in children's beliefs and their subsequent representations. But I want to draw our attention to the fact that that's a really different type of thing. That evidence falls really far short of showing that language actually influences children's beliefs and behavior in development as it unfolds in children's daily lives. Because if you think for a moment about the context in which a child hears anything, there are many utterances being said all the time in noisy environments. Children are paying attention to one thing while someone is talking about something else. They're not going to hear only one type of speech. They're not going to hear only 16 generics about gender in a row. They're going to hear a mixture of different linguistic forms. And so it's a really separate question as to whether language could be and does actually account for this aspect of development. So if we want to say, these subtle features of language can spread essentialist beliefs across communities, and they could account maybe for patterns of cross-cultural differences in social categorization, which I think is an important thing to account for, we need evidence, I think, that speaks to whether these subtle features of language are really powerful enough to have those effects in children's messy daily lives. And so in the third part of my talk, which I'll move on to now, I'd like to share with you an effort that we did last year to try to get at that tricky question. So our goal was to test development as it unfolds in children's lives outside of the lab. We did that through a big field experiment, and I'm going to tell you about the field experiment, but first I'm going to tell you how we got to designing the field experiment the way that we did. So to do this, to test the effects of language in children's daily lives, we wanted to find a category that children hear a lot of generics about in their daily life, like a plausible category where this could matter. But we also wanted to focus on a category where we thought we had some chance of manipulating what children hear. And also that we would have some chance of manipulating children's beliefs. So if, for example, we had done gender, I don't think it's impossible, but it's a really tall ask to change how people speak about gender. I don't think it's impossible, but it's hard to change how people speak about gender and already what children are thinking about gender, because they already have some essentialist beliefs about gender by the time they're 4. So we wanted to focus on a category that they're more just learning about, and where adults might find it easier to change the way they speak about it. And then, because we're going for sort of real effects in daily life here, we wanted something with testable behavioral consequences, not just consequences on children's representations. So we decided to do all of this by focusing on the category of scientists. Children are just learning about science and what it means to be a scientist in the preschool years, and so we thought we could have a chance with this. We had previously found that children do hear a lot of generics about scientists. So Sarah Jane Leslie and I did this analysis of the scripts of children's television shows in the United States and found that generics were the most common way of talking about science and scientists with young children. So this is a quote from Curious George, a popular television show. Here's another one, and we coded every reference to science, scientific, scientists, and 70% of references to science were of this form in children's television shows. Of course, all this language about scientists is meant to frame being a scientist in a positive and engaging and exciting light to young children. It's not trying to be discouraging or problematic, but we thought that because of the processes I told you about in the first part of my talk, these cues could lead children to think that you have to be a particular kind of person to succeed in science. They could cue essentialist representations of scientists, lead children to think that scientists are fundamentally different from non-scientists, and in general, to develop a sort of identity-focused representation, to think it's something about who you are that determines if you can succeed in science or not. And so, okay, we thought scientists is a reasonable possibility here. It's a category children hear a lot of generics about. It's one they're still learning about, so we can probably manipulate what they think. And although the generics are really prevalent for how people talk about science with young children, there's a really reasonable alternative, which is to talk about science more as action. So here's an example from some of the TV shows. I like science because I like experimenting with stuff. Science is all action. We found this language was in there. It was a lot less common, but it was in there, and it sounds pretty natural to talk about doing science as opposed to only talking about being a scientist and what scientists do. So we thought, okay, here's a plausible alternative that adults might find palatable and natural. So a category they hear a lot of generics about that we could manipulate, we thought, the input that they got and their beliefs as they're still developing, and then the testable behavioral consequences. And we thought that what children think about scientists, what they hear about scientists, could have testable behavioral consequences, particularly, we thought it might have testable behavioral consequences because we thought those essentialist representations of scientists could be problematic. If you're thinking about the fact that there are some people who are scientists and they're fundamentally different from non-scientists, then if you have any reason to question if you're in the scientist group, then maybe you think there's no point in even trying in science. And those reasons to question if you're a member of the scientist group could come from a lot of things. They could come from social stereotypes, like a belief that you don't look like a typical scientist. They could come from a lack of familiarity with scientists in your community. They could also come from your own experiences of difficulty in science. So we thought having an essentialist view, where some people are scientists and some people are not, could lead children to disengage from science if they have that reason to question if they're a member of the group. So we did some lab experiments before jumping into the field experiment to see if that was the case, where in this case, again, one-on-one with a child, we manipulated whether they got more generic identity-focused language about scientists or more action-focused language about science. And we then asked them to do a science game. The science game this introduction kind of explained a little bit about the scientific process in a 4-year-old friendly way. So we talked about how scientists make observations, they make guesses, and they check to see if they're right. And then we said they had the opportunity to try out either being a scientist or doing science by making observations and smelling what's in these hidden cups, making a guess about what's inside and checking to see if it's right, and then they got feedback. In our first study, we rigged it so they got 2 right and 2 wrong, and that was because we thought the 2 wrong would start to give them a little bit of a reason to question if this was something that was for them, and we thought that reason to question might be particularly problematic for children from groups that are underrepresented in science, which for our first experiment was girls in this case. So what we did then was look to see how many more trials of the science game children chose to do. So after they did those 4 rigged trials, we said, do you want to keep playing the science game or do you want to do something else? The data from girls are on the left, and what you can see is at time 0, everyone got the question, do you want to keep playing the science game or do you want to do something else? Children who got the identity-focused generic language about scientists are shown in purple, the girls are. And what you can see is that over half of them quit the game at the very first opportunity. As soon as they were given an option, do you want to keep going or do you want to do something else? They said, we want to do something else. And by the end, very few, less than a quarter, are still persisting 10 trials later. Whereas many more children, girls who were given the action-focused language, about half kept persisting all the way to the end. So that's for girls. Interestingly, and not what we predicted, we got a reverse effect for boys. So boys did more if they got the identity-focused generic language. This study was run in my lab at NYU, which tends actually physically in the lab, not out at a community location. And the sample is primarily white and upper middle class. And so we think what's happening in this sample is boys are getting a sort of stereotype lift effect. They feel confident that they're what a typical scientist looks like. So that's actually beneficial for them. But that's particular to a very specific population. So in some follow-up work that we did with more diverse samples of children across the city, these are 6-year-olds drawn from public schools in areas farther out from Manhattan, we still found a beneficial effect for girls, but this time no effect for boys. We also have found that it takes a little while, even for boys, to develop this idea that scientists look like them. So when we look in a more fine-grained way across early development, we found this time the y-axis is the number of trials of that persistence game children chose to do, and the x-axis is age from 4 to 6. Girls are on the left and boys are on the right. And what you can see is that the action-focused language has a beneficial effect for girls across age, but it actually starts out beneficial for boys too. And then the identity-focused language, the benefit of that develops between 4 and 6. And we're looking at what accounts for that in more detail right now, but my hypothesis is that what's happening is that boys in this sample are acquiring the belief, the stereotypes that benefit their own group. We also subsequently did a project that focused on children who are underrepresented in terms of race or ethnicity, so primarily Black and Hispanic children in the United States. And this was with slightly older children, 7 to 9, and we tracked their interest in science and their efficacy, their confidence that they could succeed in science across a school year longitudinally. And so this is sort of conceptually related, but methodologically quite different from what I showed you before. And what we found is that for these children, regardless of gender in this case, children remained confident and interested in doing science, a more action-focused approach to science across the school year, but their confidence and interest in being a scientist steadily dropped off across the school year that we mentioned. Okay, so we think that scientists is an interesting category to study here because children hear a lot of generics about it. There's a way to manipulate what they hear and what they think, and it has these testable behavioral consequences of influencing how much science behavior children actually want to do. So, with all that in mind, we planned this big field experiment to test whether these processes are actually powerful enough to matter in the messy environments in which children's development actually unfolds. So this time, those dots, that's all of New York City. It has 5 boroughs, all of New York City there. This time, the dots are not participants, they're schools. So we had 44 different preschools, all 4-year-old children, part of our public school system, that participated in this project. 44 different schools, about 150 teachers, and 1,500 children participated in this project. And what we did is we gave a science lesson to the teachers to give in their class. The science lesson taught about friction. So it had this ramp, and the children could cover it with different materials and feel them. So that was their observation, feel if they're rough or smooth. Then they talked about friction with their teacher and how the material might influence friction and then how fast the car would go. They could make a prediction about how far the car would get when it rolled down the ramp covered in different materials, and then they would get to race the car down the ramp and test out to see if they were right or not. And the teacher's task was to teach about friction, doing this fun activity, and also to sort of emphasize science, talk about observing, predicting, making guesses, and checking. So we gave all the teachers a training video, which they received about a week before they did the lesson. This is a still frame from the training video. So if they were in the experimental condition, then in the training video, there was a teacher who modeled the lesson using action-focused language. So they just watched this teacher do the lesson saying, hey guys, today we're gonna do science. We're gonna do science to learn about friction. Come and do science and observe. Who wants to do science next? And check. And so they just saw the teacher doing it that way. In the other condition, they saw all the same visuals, so it was very clear how to set it up and do the lesson, but we used voiceover to kind of describe the steps of the lesson without modeling any particular way of talking. And in this way, we thought teachers would just teach the lesson using whatever language they would normally do to teach a science lesson with their children. We then had them teach the lesson in their class sometime in the next week and wear an audio recorder so that we could document what they said. And the first thing to note is that the training dramatically influenced what teachers said. So here's a quote from the control condition where they just saw the voiceover explaining how to set up the lesson, but they weren't told what to say. We found a really strong tendency to use identity-focused language in that condition, even though they didn't get a model of that and it wasn't instructed. So here's an example. Scientists have a really cool job. They think about something. They create a smart thought. It's really cool because today as a scientist, you're going to ask yourself a big question. The big question you're asking yourself is, what is friction? But we successfully reduced that identity talk and increased action talk if teachers watched a video that modeled a teacher doing it that way. So, okay, today we're going to do science. Doing science means exploring the world using our 5 senses. Today we're going to do science and learn about something called friction. So we coded all the teacher language, and we looked at all the times they talked about science or scientist in reference to the activity. And over 75% of references in the control condition were of the generic identity-focused form. But in the experimental condition, that really plummeted, which means the majority were action-focused. A few days later, we came and set up a tablet-based science game in the children's classroom. So the tablet-based science game was an animated version of the car going down a ramp that children could play on their own. So they could tap it and say how far they thought the car was going to go on different materials and check it out. And this was just out on their table during a time where the kids have free play time. They could play the game, they could not. They got the first guess right, the second guess wrong, and then they could keep playing it for up to 6 trials, or they could choose to not play at all. This was a few days after the lesson, and we just used as our measure how much children persisted on this game in the classrooms, depending on which condition the teachers were assigned to and what the teachers said. So here's the relationship between what the teachers said a few days before and children's behavior a few days later. And what you can see on the left here is that the more identity references to scientists the teachers produced, the less persistent the children were when they discovered this game in their classroom a few days later. The more action-based descriptions of science the teacher said, the more persistent they were. But that effect is less strong. It's mostly driven by the reduction in the generic. This is attention to treat analysis, so holding aside what the teachers actually said. Am I out of time? I'm sorry. Okay. How much out of time? Oh dear, okay. Holding aside for a moment variation in what they said, on average, students persisted more if they went to a classroom where the teacher had been assigned to the experimental condition than when they had been assigned to the control. So I'll just end by saying 3 very quick things. I'm sorry about that. First, this was a one-session field experiment. I don't think this one training experience would shape children's representations for the long term. It's more of a proof of concept that subtle features of language are powerful enough to shape children's behavior even when they hear the language and behave in much messier environments. And here's my last things. First, very quickly, I've shown you that these subtle features of language can lead children to treat these differences as more important as indicating fundamentally distinct kinds, and that this can have some negative consequences. I've already said that several times, so I'm not going to say more on it, but I do want to say this part, the and, not, but also, which is kind of the implications and not implications of this research. First, it's really important to note that generics do not always do this. There's going to be a great talk, I'm sure it will be great, on Saturday by Nadia Vasilevia, who's sitting right there, on when generics do not elicit social essentialism. So I really encourage everyone to attend that as well. It's also the case that other processes are at play too. So generic language on their own don't do all of this. Other forms of language matter and other forms of experiences matter. And then the very last thing I'll say is that I've been talking about a lot of the negative consequences of social categorization, but recognizing and appreciating social differences is actually a really important thing for children growing up in diverse societies. So I'm not trying to argue for using language to minimize social differences. Rather, I'm suggesting we need to be aware of the implications of our language and point out that sometimes features of our language can affect children's beliefs and behaviors in ways that are different from what adults might anticipate or intend. And I had some more implications, but I'll just end there and take some of your questions. Sorry for going over. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Hi.
Hey, that was great, thanks. I'm wondering about 2 things. They're related. So one is hierarchical representations and trying to determine what level of a hierarchy would be most informative based on distributions of traits or features. And if that might be what's going on in our use of generics for social categories. I'll stop there.
Well, I think that's right, in that what children probably assume from the generic is that this category, this level of the hierarchy has this more than like a sort of comparable, like this is what differentiates girls from all children and makes them different from boys, that kind of thing. I do think that's what's going on in the, or at least that's part of what's going on. I mean, it's not all of what's going on because there's also the stuff about assuming certain causal mechanisms and there's stuff about, so unless you mean that as well, that what it does is communicate this is a useful way to divide up a larger category sort of more generally. But one of the things that we find from generics is that children do assume when you hear like girls do X, they also assume that boys do not do X more so. So I do think what they are doing, that they differentiate in that way. I'm not sure that fully answers, but we can talk more maybe. Thank you for the question.
Well, thank you for this really remarkably, well, this talk gave evidence that, you know, you know, that you have been really chosen as somebody who's doing the most interesting kind of research, I think. And in terms of the, in the field, no, in the creativity of these designs, and I'll say something more control, you know, not just an observation. So what struck me by learning more about your research is that you're really exploring how how language in its subtle ways, as you say, or its different forms of putting, you know, generic or particular descriptions on events, and looking at in real context, basis of massive basis of the kind of experiences. This is great. This is wonderfully interesting. But I mean, the way sometimes you still, and here is what I would like to add, is that here that just for doing it for the scientific constraints, we are doing it like that. When you say that now one variable that the sentence will do, what will the sentence do? What's the effect of using that kind of sentence? First of all, suggest these frequency counts of, or that will be, you think, informative. You did point out that this is not obvious that it has to be like that.
Right.
But also, like, sometimes the way you are representing this, and I should be the last person. Anyway, in these puppet representations of, like, reading, asking questions or providing descriptions and then looking at the text in the book in front of them. It's like reading as a truth. This fundamental display of, so I think this is very, there is a pragmatic question how the way you test these effects are interpreted by the children. Really,
I think that's right, and I think that, so part of it being that, like, in the context of the experiments, we're providing a pragmatic context in which for them to take the information seriously.
So there is, okay.
Oh.
I'll tell you the rest later.
Okay.
Oh, he says I should just speak to the microphone,
dear.
and I can make a second point.
Okay.
Well, don't. Colleen.
No, I'm not going to overuse my time.
Okay, well, we will discuss it. Thank you.
So I have a practical
Where are you?
question. I'm here.
Oh, hey, okay.
Hello.
Hi.
How are you? So as a parent, okay, there is this push and pull and this tension with highlighting social differences between groups and respecting cultures that are not the one that you're from.
Yep.
And if kids have this bias to draw essentialist inferences, then how can we do both of these things at the same time? Tell me what to say.
Right, so that is a great question, and thank you for asking it. And it's something that we're really actively working on because we recognize the importance of being able to tell you what to say, and we think it's a really complicated thing because some of the things, like one might think, if you just use generics to describe positive things, then it's fine. And I think our research suggests that that can be problematic as well, because children's inferences go beyond the content. So, there's one thing, which is that talking about specific families doing specific things is probably more helpful than making general claims about, like, what a religion does or speakers of a particular language do. Like, this family is X and this family does Y. That's probably a little bit of a safer approach. I also find that easier in my conversations with my own children. Then I think there's I think knowing that children are likely to generalize beyond, we can sort of counteract that with doing both things at once. It's not minimizing differences, or it doesn't have to be minimizing differences to talk about both, to talk about ways in which we respect different cultural practices and why they're an important part of human diversity, and then also talk about ways in which we're the same. There's a way to do that that I think is problematic, but I also think there's a way to do it that can strike the right balance. Then there's this whole question of, if you provide explicitly anti-essentialist explanation, like structural explanations, extrinsic explanations for certain things, is that going to fix it? And I think that's a really open question because we don't always know how young children are interpreting those. So that's something we're actively working on. So I share the goal of your question, that I think there's the potential of this research program to really inform that. I think we've got some really practical advice for teachers in talking about science. We've also developed, which I can talk about another time, some practical advice for parents in how to respond to gender generics. But in terms of the really tricky question that you raised about how to talk about things like race, ethnicity, culture, linguistic in a way that can both lead children to appreciate social differences but not over-essentialize, we just don't have all the work on that yet. So, but I agree, it's really important, and I think we can get there with more specific recommendations, but I don't want to overclaim what we have now.
Okay, then I'll tell you, I've never done it, but I really would like to do like just this fake Saint Nicholas, Saint Nicholas
Santa
Day,
Claus.
Santa Claus. Okay, it actually there are two forms. That there are cultures where it appears on a different day than Christmas, and then there are in America and England, I think they overlap in Christmas, and this is just like Father Christmas. But there are those like in Hungary where you have Santa Claus coming December 6th.
Right.
And I have been, every institution where you work, they have their own Santa Claus event you take your child to. And my child tells me that I'm only coming this year to the Santa Claus event if they bring the real Santa Claus, not like the fake one last year. So it was very much. So the idea was to actually arrange a Santa Claus event in which what I noticed that Hungarian culture, at least, is very lax about counter-evidences becoming visible, and the Santa Claus is white beard starts to come off, or you notice your father's trousers, or you can smell.
So,
Anyway, this is very, and everybody's just laughing, and the children want to keep on believing there is a Santa Claus, but so the attitude is lax, I would say, and especially compared like to Jesus Christ. You would never do that.
Judy, I have a question.
The question is that,
No, it doesn't matter.
no question, just enthusiasm.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Oh,